Hi, everyone, and welcome to Equity at the Polls, Voter Access in California, hosted by California Humanities as part of our initiative, California on the Ballot. My name is Kristin Vega. I'm Program Associate at California Humanities, and I am delighted to be joined today by our guests, Alisa Belinkoff Katz, Kristin Nimmers, and Laurie Passante. In the political experiment that is the American Republic, California may be the most visible laboratory. What does the electoral history of a state, often considered to be the seat of the nation's social, technological, and cultural innovation, have to tell us about the future of American democracy? Our state's variety of cultures, languages, and opinions yields a nearly infinite variety of possibilities for civic engagement. And in this free series of virtual events, we like to reflect on civic engagement, how it currently looks in California, and ask what changes might soon be in store. Today's program is the first in season 2 of California on the Ballot. The theme is Barriers to Voting. What work is left to do to increase voter access in California after so many changes since the end of World War II? If you're not familiar with California Humanities, we are the independent nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Since 1975, we have produced, funded, and supported humanities projects and programs across the state in every congressional district, awarding over $38 million in grants. Before I turn the microphone over to our lovely moderator, Elisa Belinkoff Katz, a couple items of business. We would love to hear from you during this session. Please do send questions for the panel in the Q&A. And also, I'd like to thank our funder. California on the Ballot is made possible by funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the A More Perfect Union initiative, which we'll link to in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Elisa. Elisa Belinkoff Katz is the lead author of UCLA's recent report, Reckoning with Our Rights, The Evolution of Voter Access in California. It's a fascinating read. We'll put a link in the chat. Highly recommend you check it out. Elisa is a senior fellow of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. She also served for nearly 30 years as chief deputy to the Los Angeles City Council member and county supervisor, Zev Yaroslavsky. And with that, I'll hand it over to Elisa.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Kirsten. And thank you to California Humanities for organizing this event and inviting us to participate. I'm really looking forward to an interesting conversation. First, I'd like to introduce our other panelists. Kristin Nimmers serves as policy and campaign manager with the California Black Power Network. She has led and coordinated policy analysis and legislative advocacy for California Calls and the Black Census and Redistricting Hub, working with organizations across the state to engage Black communities in the redistricting process and ensure political districts are drawn fairly and equitably. Kristen joins us from Los Angeles. Welcome, Kristen. Our other panelist is Laurie Passante. Laurie is Director of Civic Engagement at the Dolores Huerta Foundation in the Central Valley, where she's based in Bakersfield. She leads grassroots redistricting, voter engagement, legislative and election protection campaigns, activating communities to vindicate their right to vote despite voter suppression. Laurie longs to see a Central Valley free of systemic racism and economic inequality, where all people thrive and not just survive. Welcome to the panel, Laurie. And by the way, both Laurie and Kristen are attorneys and I am not, so go easy on me, guys, okay? So as Kirsten said, I was privileged to serve as lead author of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy 2020 study on voter access in California. And you'll see you'll get the link, but I'm going to give you a little précis of it. Our key finding is that for the first 100 years of its history as a state, California took explicit steps to prevent many non-white, immigrant, and working class citizens from voting. This turned around, though, quite dramatically after about 1960, and since then, the state has passed numerous laws to open up access to the polls. But despite these efforts, California's voters do not reflect the diversity of our people. We are a majority-minority state with an electorate that leans older, whiter, and wealthier than the population. So our goal today is to talk about why and what can be done about it. So I'll start with giving you a little bit of the history. First, I want to talk about barriers to race, barriers of race in California voting access over the years. The first California Constitution, dated in 1849, limited the franchise to white male citizens. They were the only people who could vote. California never had slavery and fought on the side of the North during the Civil War, but there were many Confederate sympathizers here. And in fact, California was one of only 2 free states to vote against ratification of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. Of course, that amendment was ratified by other states, and Black men were able to register, but there were just a few thousand at the time. Native Americans were also excluded if they maintained their tribal relations. They weren't even considered citizens, and this was not overturned until 1924. But the real issue in late 19th century California history was Chinese, who constituted almost 9% of the population in 1870. There was a great deal of anti-Chinese sentiment and many violent attacks on Chinese immigrants. And a new constitution was adopted by the state in 1879 that specifically provided that, quote unquote, no native of China shall ever exercise the privilege of the franchise in this state. So tremendous barriers based on race to voting in California since 1849. There were also what I'm calling barriers of class. One of these barriers is voter registration, which many believe operates as a form of voter suppression, especially for poor people and immigrants, since it requires a would-be voter to take time off work, go downtown, interact with public officials, speak English, etc. It's a hoop that people have to jump through. In many countries now, voter registration is automatic. The US is actually one of only a handful of democratic countries that places the entire burden of registration on the citizen. And the movement to require voter registration in the US began in the northeastern states that were heavily impacted by immigration in the middle of the 19th century, and it was a way of controlling their access to the vote. California followed suit and adopted voter registration in 1866. We also adopted an English literacy requirement for voting in 1894, which of course also impacted immigrants and many poor and less well-educated people. And there were many other barriers. There were very strict residency requirements, which was a problem because poor people tended to move all the time. For about a 30-year period, you had to re-register with every election cycle. So every 2 years, you had to get yourself back to the registrar's office and re-register. Even when they got rid of that, there was a requirement that you had to vote at every single election, primary and general, or else you got kicked off the rolls. So again, very difficult to maintain your voting status. Now, there were some improvements in voter access during this period. Women got the right to vote in California before they did in the rest of the country. Women got it here in 1911. And absentee voting was created in 1922. But the rules for absentee voting were very limited. You had to be able to show that you were going to be out of town. So it was really pretty much restricted to the wealthy and the educated, people who could plan ahead. So this was a situation for about the first 100 years of California's history. After World War II, though, and especially during and after the Civil Rights era, things really began to change. Since China was our ally during World War II, restrictions on Chinese immigration and naturalization were removed soon after the war. Then in the late 1950s, the state really pivoted towards inclusivity. Instead of worrying about voter fraud and about unauthorized people voting, they worried about expanding access to the polls. And literally, in pretty much every year since then, there's been an improvement in voter access in California. So just a few examples. In 1957, registrars of voters were required to establish convenient locations for voters to register, not just downtown, but throughout the county. In 1961, the law allowed for citizen deputy registrars so we could have voter registration drives. They expanded the rules for who could vote absentee. They fixed the voter purge. In 1978, they had no excuse absentee voting, so anyone could vote absentee. Then there were lawsuits and constitutional amendments. They got rid of the English literacy requirement, lowered the voting age to 18, got rid of the excessive residency requirements. And then it just kept going and going. Early voting in 1994, permanent absentee voting in 2001, vote by mail, internet registration, same-day registration. Now we have new motor voter, which is a transition to almost automatic voter registration. In 2016, the Voters' Choice Act, and then in 2020, of course, for the pandemic, everyone was mailed a ballot. We had universal vote by mail. And in 2022, this became permanent. So while other states are pulling back on the ease and accessibility of voting, California keeps pushing ahead. And indeed, in the 2020 election, we had almost a 71% turnout of eligible population, which was the highest since 1952. But although we had a very high turnout, those who turned out to vote remained older, whiter, wealthier, and more educated than the adult population at large. So the purpose of our discussion this afternoon is to talk about, why does this happen? Why do California elections today not fully reflect the diversity of our state? So the first question I'm going to ask is, well, what is the role of county election officials in facilitating turnout? Is there more that they could do? Are there things that can be done at the county level that would help improve these unfortunate figures? Laurie or Kristen?
I can start. I think, county officials have a really big role in facilitating turnout. They're tasked with educating the public and administering these elections in ways that are accessible to all voters. And in relation to diversity, that means that it's really important that they're thinking intentionally about things like the number of drop boxes, or whether there's public transportation to a polling site, and what areas might have different language needs, even beyond those required translations of 12 languages. There are significant internet disparities in accessibility, so everyone isn't able to check election information on websites. So everyone doesn't have social media. How are folks being educated or included in that county outreach when they don't necessarily have accessibility to those things that we think are easy and accessible?
The only thing I would add to that, which is I totally agree with 100%, is that selection of polling locations, whether or not the county is a Voters' Choice Act county, the extent to which the features of a Voters' Choice Act county get implemented, even if they choose not to be a Voters' Choice Act county, that's all something that is recommended by the Registrar of Voters. And increasingly, when independent redistricting commissions are implemented in a county, like was done in several counties this cycle, it's usually the Registrar of Voters that decides who's eligible to serve on that commission, which impacts voting rights for 10 years or more.
What about the question of, I'm interested in how this might differ from county to county. So Laurie, you're based in the Central Valley, and is there a difference in how rural and inland county officials handle these issues as opposed to more urban kind of coastal counties?
Definitely, and although my experience is primarily in the Central Valley, I can definitely tell you that among the Central Valley counties, only Fresno is a Voters' Choice Act county. Pretty much every other county is what's called a traditional polling place county, which to some extent does make sense because, for example, in Kern County, we are like 3 counties in one. We have the high desert, mountains, valley floor, rural communities, farm worker communities. To some extent, that makes sense. However, what I haven't seen become uniform, unfortunately, is the early in-person voting opportunities. Kern County, for example, had a pretty counterintuitive scheduling of early in-person voting opportunities, whereas Kings County, Tulare County, and Fresno County, they were in lockstep with one another and had pretty intuitive, okay, every weekend, 3 weeks prior to the election, we'll have early in-person voting opportunities. And then also funding is a huge issue. We tend to have boards of supervisors in the Central Valley that do not support the Registrar of Voters functions. It's severely underfunded, which really leads to a lot of problems.
And Kristen, have you discovered in your work, I know you're based in Los Angeles, but I think you work statewide. How do you see it in the counties where the communities you work with are located?
Yeah, I think similarly, it is different from county to county. Like when I was talking about internet accessibility, that's a big issue for, I think, rural communities. That isn't as much of an issue in urban communities. And I think also there's just like a difference in, say, the VCA counties versus regular counties. Like Black voters tend to rely on polling places that they've gone their whole lives or that have been the same for many years. And then now there's been all of this change around like what that looks like, where those centers are, and how that voting process works. And so I think that there's just, like Laurie said, a need for like investment in the education of folks. So.
Yeah. So let's go on to the issue that you just raised, in particular about the Black population. There's been two recent reports that have just come out, one by the Public Policy Institute of California and another by the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC. And they were both looking to establish how turnout differed in 2020 from prior years. And they looked at two things that were happening simultaneously: universal vote by mail, but also a consolidation of in-person voting options. So instead of the neighborhood polling places, many counties consolidated polling places, either in the neighborhood, but you still had to go to a polling place in your neighborhood, or on a countywide basis where you could go to any voting location in the county and you could pull up your local ballot and vote. But either way, there was no longer the neighborhood polling place. And what they found is that while the turnout gap between whites and other groups was narrowed due to the universal vote by mail, the consolidation of in-person voting options had the opposite effect. It widened the turnout gap, especially for African Americans and Latinos. So, for example, they found that that in 2020, 64% of eligible Black voters cast a ballot, compared to 74.5% of non-Hispanic whites. And this was a wider gap actually than in prior years. So I'm wondering, I guess you've already kind of commented on that, but did you see that effect in your communities? And how much of a problem is this, and what can be done to resolve it?
Yeah, definitely saw that in the communities. Like I mentioned, folks rely on polling places that have been in their neighborhoods for years. But on top of that, Black voters, especially just due to the history of disenfranchisement that you talked about, are really wary and skeptical of like voting systems where they can't see their ballot being cast. And so I think, mail-in ballots pose an issue for that reason. There's like a lot of distrust of government. And then also, a lot of Black voters, like in the CID report that you mentioned, they go to voting centers to receive assistance and use like accessible machines, especially Black older voters. And then it's seen as like, voting is seen in our community as symbolic and often feels like it's important to go in person and be seen and represent for your communities. So when you're limiting that, that also makes a difference in how folks are going or how they're seeing this voting process as well. So definitely.
And how about transportation? Is lack of transportation an issue also?
Yeah, definitely, because Black voters tend to use public transportation to get to polling places. So that also made a huge difference as well.
Yeah. And what are you seeing on that, Laurie?
So when we looked at the voter turnout for the 2020 election in the Central Valley, we saw voter turnout rates of eligible voters as high as 98% in a very affluent part of West Bakersfield, all the way down to about 21% in parts of West Tulare. And one of the things that we learned when we spoke to people in West Tulare was that the farther you go out into the rural area from an urban core, the lower the voter turnout will be. And one of the reasons for that is because the drop boxes that they might have out there, they get filled by about 10 a.m. and nobody comes to empty them. And if you don't have the ability to turn it in to the drop box, you may not trust the mail service. You may not have gotten your vote by mail ballot in the mail because somebody stole your mail. You're not going to have transportation to go the 60 or 70 or 80 or maybe more miles to get to the elections department in Visalia or in Bakersfield or in Fresno or in Hanford. And a lot of people didn't know that they were getting their ballots in the mail. And so when they went to try to vote, they were told to surrender their vote by mail ballot. And they said, "What vote by mail ballot?" And they all had thrown it away, not realizing what it was or never received it in the first place. In Kern County, there was a huge problem because they basically told all of their poll workers to send people to the elections department in downtown Bakersfield. The line was out the door, around the building, into the parking lot. People gave up. They really had a difficult time with it. And they were denied the ability to vote provisional in a lot of cases. And since Kern County doesn't have electronic poll books, even if they had been given a provisional, they wouldn't have been able to vote a precinct-specific ballot. So this is we have huge problems with the consolidation of polling places and the vote by mail ballot system in the Central Valley.
You know, this is so interesting because so many times these election accessibility improvements don't really make elections more accessible for previously excluded groups. They make it easier for groups that always vote a lot. You know, I mean, you mentioned 92% turnout in the wealthier areas, something like that.
98.
98, yeah, that's stunning. And it's been the same with absentee voting. You know, absentee voting was a great improvement, but it really just improved voting for people who were already going to vote. It just made it easier for them. And it seems that vote by mail has really very much done the same thing. So let me ask the two of you, what is the solution to this? Should the law be changed regarding the consolidation? Should additional requirements be put on registrars of voters? What do we need another law, or do we just need to kind of talk with our registrars? What's the way out of this? What's the solution?
I'll go ahead and take a stab at it, and then I'm sure Kristen has some really good thoughts too. For sure, electronic poll books. I think that as a general proposition, there should be funding mandates at the county level for those institutions that promote a healthy democracy. Because, for example, when we don't have libraries that function very well, or they're not open at all, then they can't be relied upon to be polling centers or early in-person voting, which is what Kern County tried to do. They tried to rely on the library system, but they don't fund it sufficiently. And so people have, they don't go there, or they only allowed it in an affluent area and not so much in a rural area that's low income. We need remote participation at public meetings. We need remote participation and internet functionality throughout the entire state, especially in rural and low income areas. We need our schools to be supportive of democratic functionality. We need probably back-end automatic voter registration because the front-end system really impacts especially people who are not citizens, unfortunately. Those are probably more broad brush remedies, policy and budgetary remedies. But I hesitate very much to do some sort of universal policy fix on the state level, because there's such vast diversity between areas in like the Central Valley that just really, we are very unique, and we need to be heard when we speak to our uniqueness and explain to people what it is. And we also need to have autonomy, not given to the boards of supervisors who tend not to listen to people in the rural counties, but to those of us who are helping citizens to raise their voices, to be able to complain to the state, expedited accountability processes and complaint procedures, perhaps to the Secretary of State's office, things of that nature, something to give some accountability on the local level to the people who need it.
Wow. Okay, Kristen, what can you add?
Yeah, I think a lot of these changes have been really valuable and really helpful. Like, it is creating accessibility to mail folks their ballot, but I think that there isn't as much understanding of these processes, and there's much more education needed around like how the VCA counties work and what folks' options are. Like, and then there needs to be additional focus, not just on general outreach, but outreach specifically to hard to reach communities, to infrequent voter communities. For example, Prop 17 passed and 50,000 new folks are eligible to vote now. And so, but those folks may be confused about whether or not they're allowed to vote, what that looks like, how they register. Like, that kind of education is really needed, and there isn't as much investment in, hard to reach communities and educating them. Another thing is, translation of materials. For example, California has one of the largest populations of Black immigrant communities. Many African languages aren't a part of the 12 that are required to be translated, which tend to be, Asian languages, Spanish, English, etc. Arabic is in there too. But there are a lot of languages that aren't actually being translated for African communities, which have concentrations in LA and San Diego. And so that's also really a huge.
Yeah, and I've heard quite a bit about problems with translations of ballot materials that they could use some improvements. So yeah, Laurie, I didn't understand what you meant by back-end voter registration. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so right now we have a front end system where, and in fact, I just saw it myself. I had to renew my driver's license. I went and I did the little screen and I did the touch screen. And if you blink, you could miss it and accidentally say yes to voter registration instead of no. And especially if you're limited English proficient, that can cause huge problems. If you're trying to adjust status, if you're, a green card holder or, a TPS status holder, and you're trying to adjust to, become a citizen, to naturalize, that can really harm your ability to do it because it makes it look like you were trying to register to vote when you didn't have the legal right to do so. And so we've heard of people who get impacted by that. Then the burden's on them to prove that they didn't mean to do that. A back-end system would automatically register people to vote when they have presented materials indicating that they are eligible to vote, a passport, citizenship papers, a birth certificate. It would automatically register them to vote. They could do it at Health and Human Services or a DMV, but then the DMV is the one that bears the burden of fixing the mistake if there's a problem because the voter didn't affirmatively say, yes, I want to vote. And then the Secretary of State's office would send a postcard out and say, hey, you were registered to vote when you were at this point, blah, blah, blah. Is this what you want? Do you want to opt out? And other states that have implemented this and have had like maybe 2 to 3% of voters registered opt out, and it has significantly increased the fluidity of the process.
Okay. Let's move on to a slightly different, let's kind of switch a little bit. What is the responsibility, would you say, of candidates and campaigns in this matter? What responsibility do they bear? What can they do to bring out the voters of their communities, voters who are underrepresented? How can they help?
I think maybe to start, part of the responsibility is just, the idea of most campaigns, especially candidate campaigns, which is kind of understandable, is that, we want to turn out this many people or we need this many votes. So we're going to reach out to the people we know vote. But part of the barrier for folks, I think, is like a lack of understanding of our election process, of the candidate issues. And in order to empower infrequent voters, we have to actually talk to them, which I don't think folks do. Campaign candidates don't talk to infrequent voters. A lot of our outreach strategies are centered around frequent voters and what they typically need and what folks typically respond to, but we need to do the untypical, I think. So that's kind of the responsibility.
Yeah. Laurie,
I'm not so sure that the kind of education that we have already outlined is necessary. It's deep, it's consistent, it's multi-layered. Really, I don't see that as being the responsibility of any particular candidate, especially when you think about some folks that have been marginalized forever, and maybe they're trying to run and finally change some things for their communities. Just learning how to navigate an election process is enough for some of those folks that I see at the local level, especially. I would far prefer to see the government entities responsible for running the elections and our educational institution partners have a coordinated, well-funded, consistent process for civic education to get so that so we can reach the people who are not plugging into the process.
What do the organizations like the two organizations that you two work for, tell us about what you do and how you participate in getting out the vote and getting more people energized and active in elections?
I think we'll probably both say this, but we just act as trusted messengers in our community. I think that, trusted messengers and that outreach tends to be more effective. Like there's deeper insight that you have into the best ways to talk to community. For example, I mentioned like formerly incarcerated folks in Prop 17, like talking to those folks may be a different approach than talking to young new voters who are on social media and can be impacted that way versus folks who need in-person kind of conversations to understand the process. And so I think that, community organizations just really understand what the community needs and can give that insight to folks.
I think we saw this with the census, and we saw this with COVID outreach during the pandemic. The partnership between, a government entity, city, county, or state level, or an educational institution, or both, and community-based organizations that are the trusted messenger organizations is really, really powerful. It's very powerful because whereas an educational institution and a government entity might be able to do the broad brushstrokes to get things to about 80%, you're always going to have your hard to count census tract folks that are pretty easily identifiable because we have that hard to count, census tract terminology and identification process. That's where your CBOs come in. That's where your trusted messengers come in. And we should really just continue that really strategic partnership that has gotten us the count that we got in the middle of a pandemic for the census and has gotten the vaccination rates that we were looking for. Guess what? We can use it for civic participation too.
Yeah. Okay. Kristen, you've been working hard in the last few years on redistricting issues. So tell us about how the outcome of redistricting has affected voter turnout, in particular in the Black community. How does that function?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say at this moment since the districts were just adopted earlier this year. So this primary will be kind of the first time we're seeing that turnout. But I think in our advocacy, we really tried to make sure that Black communities were kept together in ways that didn't dilute voting power. So for example, in the Bay, we advocated a lot and we were successful on one level for Congress to create this district in the Contra Costa Solano area that united Black communities that were split. So it used to be 10%, 5 to 10% of Black voters split between three different districts, and we got to put them together so that their percentage came up to 20-30%. And so that gives folks an influence over the election, even though they're not the majority. And so that was really what we tried to do throughout the state, just to make sure that there was enough voting power within these districts to have influence. So if you know that you're going to have an influence, you're going to have an impact on this election, I think folks are more likely to turn out than if they just feel I'm 5% of this voting population, I don't have any power.
Yeah, okay. And Laurie, let me ask you a different question. To what extent do at-large elections inhibit voter turnout in the communities that you work in?
So the Central Valley has a demographic makeup that roughly tracks no matter where you go. 30% white population, 70+% people of color, and Latinos in particular are now over 50% of the population in every Central Valley county, all 11 of them. So when you have districts that are drawn well, and it is a districted entity, then you're absolutely drawing things in a way when it's in alignment with the Voting Rights Act. You lift up voices that have tended to say, well, there's nothing for me in this process. When you have at-large districts, those 98% voter turnout folks are going to outvote the other 70% every election. You might as well not even show your vote really doesn't count in those cases.
And do you so I know in Southern California, in the Los Angeles area, quite a few cities have been challenged by voter rights groups and by with their attorneys who say, this and that protected group doesn't have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice because you have at-large elections. So either prove that what you're doing is legitimate under the Voting Rights Act, or you have to district yourselves. And are you seeing a movement like that in the Central Valley cities?
Yes, because when Kern County, for example, was sued, the Luna case is the one that you would want to look at. Deeply interesting. They did a racially polarized voting analysis, and it showed unquestionably, especially in the Central Valley and in Kern County in particular, white voters just don't vote for candidates of color. They just don't, unfortunately. We're not there yet, right? And so when you have high levels of racially polarized voting in an at-large system, it is a deeply unfair system for people of color, no question about it. So I would say that, and we still have many jurisdictions that are at large. It would probably be a good policy solution at the state level to just require flat out that any entities over a certain population, they should just go to districts, period.
And Kristen, do you find that as well, that white voters won't vote for candidates of color in the communities that you work in?
You know, I wouldn't know data-wise, but I do think that like at large elections tend to empower frequent overrepresented voters. And like, just like I was talking about the percentages, like if you have a low voting population in that area, then you're gonna have less influence over it, especially within an at-large election. So I would agree with a lot of what you said.
Yeah, okay. So let me ask this. Of course, there's more to there's more to the issue of voting and to political participation. Back up. There's more to political participation than just voting. Okay, so there's a lot of other means of citizen engagement. You can call your elected official. You can attend a public meeting. You can go to a protest. You can sign a petition. You can raise money to support a candidate. You can organize your neighbors. You know, there's a lot that you can do, and I know that some of the work on expanding citizen engagement has gone in this direction of, can we get people to get involved in other ways? So can you both talk about what's going on in your communities to expand that level of interest? Because we have the same disparities, you know, just as whites vote more often than other groups, whites also participate in all these areas that I just outlined more than other groups. So how do we improve participation in these other areas?
I wasn't sure if Laurie went to go first, but I'll say, you know, I don't have a concrete answer for that. I think that's a big question, but I think part of the issue for Black communities is that we don't have as much representation in the legislature or in a lot of these elected positions. And because of that, folks don't tend to call because they don't necessarily think they're going to have an influence or be heard. And so like that engagement with electeds is lost because they don't see enough folks that actually look like them, that have like that specific representation and have a mindset and understanding, like a cultural understanding, and an understanding of like the issues that are specifically within that community. So I think a part of it is like related to the barriers of folks of color getting elected generally, which I think is part of like Laurie mentioned, like navigating how to become an elected, but also relates to like campaign finance and the ability of like low-income diverse candidates to actually be able to have the opportunity to run. So I think that that's probably a big part of it as well.
Yeah.
I'll add that of the boards of supervisors in the Central Valley, you know, each county has 5 supervisors, right? And I just mentioned that the demographics are 70+% people of color, 30% white residents in the Central Valley. But the representation on the boards of supervisors is exactly opposite. You've got 4 white members of the board and 1 person of color in every single Central Valley county in the whole valley. So when I see people go to the board, and this happens in the school districts and the special districts as well. When I see people who have serious problems related to disenfranchisement in their communities go before these boards and councils, they are not heard. So for example, I was at a high school board meeting. The entire Black community came out because there was a young man who literally had been kneed in the neck at a high school in Bakersfield and really hurting. They had like 60 people at this high school meeting and were not heard in any way, shape, or form by the trustees. But there was a white woman who got up and said, I want to do this little issue here that had to do with like an exchange program of some kind. And it was like, how can I help you? Give me your phone number, yada, yada, yada. It is blatant, the discrimination. So I understand why people are saying, why should I bother?
And do you tie that to districting, like the Board of Supervisors districts, or do you tie it to a failure of voter turnout, or both?
Well, you're asking if it's the chicken or the egg, and in this case, I'm going to say it's the districts, because while we saw amazing alignment with the demographics in the Central Valley at our Assembly, State Senate, congressional districts, thank God that commission did a great job. But at the local level, total gerrymandering. And this is true of the high school district as well. And as long as folks don't have an opportunity for a majority on their boards, they're going to have no say. So yeah, I think that leads to the voter turnout being low.
And let me just ask you, what about the changes to the Federal Voting Rights Act? Has that, given the state of voting rights in your communities, has the changes to the Voting Rights Act been a problem?
I'm deeply concerned not only by the changes that we've seen already, but the ones that we anticipate are to come. We have no champion for voting rights on the Supreme Court right now. And in fact, Chief Justice Roberts has a long history, decades long, of trying to dismantle the Voting Rights Act. In Kings County here in the Central Valley, they are a Section 5 county that when the Shelby case was decided in 2013, suddenly they didn't have to ask for pre-clearance anymore before they redistricted or changed their voting rules. Now it's a free-for-all. I participated in that process for redistricting in the last year, and it was appalling how blatantly corrupt the process was.
Okay, Kristen, you want to chime in on this? Voting Rights Act?
Don't really have much to chime in on as far as the Supreme Court case, but I do know that if a county traditionally had those issues, that it is important to continue to kind of check up on those and make sure that whatever processes and how they're administering it is fair and accessible. It kind of gives folks a free rein to kind of go back to something unless they are being watched and that's being enforced for folks. So.
And what about the racial justice movement of the last few years? There's certainly been a lot more people paying attention and marching in the streets and making their voices heard. Has that resonated at the ballot box?
I don't think so, because I think that there are other barriers. Like, I think folks like to think that like political apathy is the issue or people just don't care, but it's like the very existence of me as a Black woman is political. So a lot of folks definitely do care, definitely do want to vote, but there are these barriers that are involved within the system to folks getting registered. Like Laurie mentioned, back-end registration, that's a barrier. The voter outreach and education, too hard to reach communities, that's a barrier. The lack of representation, that's a barrier. Campaign finance, that's a barrier. So there are just like all of these barriers, I think, even though folks are becoming more politically engaged. But I think that we're working definitely, like even within our coalition to make sure that we're removing those. So.
And last question, do people, sometimes people say they don't vote because they don't think it matters, because they don't think it's going to make a difference, because politicians are going to just do what politicians do, and and nothing ever changes. And do you hear that in your communities? And if so, what can organizations like the ones you work with and people like the people who are on this call, what can we all do about that?
I do hear that. And shout out to my students at Bakersfield College. I teach one class a semester, and it never fails. Every time I teach, the minute I start teaching about the history of our local environment, the history that we're swimming in here in the Central Valley, all of the studies about what's really going on, they always say, like, why did I never learn this before? How come nobody's talking about this? And light bulbs turn on. And it may be that folks may start out feeling disempowered and because they just don't see a path forward from where they are to what is on the other side. But every person who I interact with who starts getting access to the right information and getting plugged into people who are participating in things and bringing the other folks along with them, there's not a single person I work with, not a single student I've ever taught who doesn't say, oh my God, let me be a part of this. I think that this is why the humanities work that this entire organization is dedicated to is so profoundly important, because it is every single bit is one brick that builds the foundation for all of us to stand on together.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think I'll turn it over to Kirsten Vega to give us some audience questions.
Thanks, Elisa, and thanks, Laurie and Kristen. Yeah, we're just getting some audience questions here. The first one I see is, what role do you think public schools might be able to play in increasing election engagement?
I think I have said throughout these questions, education is important. So I think that voter education is important, but like letting folks know as they're in high schools, et cetera, this is what you can do to pre-register, and also just like honing in on that importance of civic engagement, like connecting all of these different positions to folks' real life. Like you might learn about the different branches of government, but that doesn't mean that you understand how they impact you. And so talking deeper about that with students as well.
I think that it's not just about reading the textbook in class. I think people need to be required to get out there and be a part of things, go to public meetings, go to the court and observe court. I think that a lot of people are afraid to even walk through the door. And I think when we encourage our students and take them with us to go, things become a lot more real. And it's not just something on a page that they're being forced to read after lunch when they're not paying attention. We got to make it real for people, and the schools have a responsibility to do that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who, maybe their parents never voted, and maybe their grandparents never voted, and voting's just not a thing in their community, let's say. And we need a lot of education to link these, to open the eyes of people to how voting is important and voting impacts your life, and how important this connection is. And education is key to that, absolutely.
Another question that was touched on a little bit is about the idea of ranked choice voting. California is kind of mixed in this sense. Some elections in some districts function this way, others don't. It's also a procedure that was sort of imported from elections in other places outside of the state. So I'm wondering how you see the impact of ranked choice voting where it happens, A, and then B, are there other mechanisms or innovations from international elections that you think could be worth a try here in the States?
That's a hard question. And I know that a big problem in election administration is the cost of elections, and in particular when you have when someone gets elected to Congress, then you have to have another election to fill their old Senate seat, and then you have to have another election to fill that person's assembly seat, and we have this sort of ongoing cycle of elections, and it's all quite expensive. So people are looking to changes that will help with that. And I think ranked choice voting is considered one of those, but I don't really know much about it or have an opinion on it. Perhaps Kristen or Laurie has more to say about that.
Well, I know that there are several bills in the legislature right now about ranked choice voting, and we have not really made it a high priority to engage in, but we definitely evaluate what, for example, the ACLU is piecing together, because their recommendations have made a lot of sense. It doesn't appear that ranked choice voting is something that we're seeing here in the Central Valley, but of the models that I've seen, there are some models that appear to be quite good, especially when you are talking about environments where you are seeing at-large districts used still, and there's nothing you can really do about it yet. So definitely not opposed to it, but it has to be the right model and the right fit.
What they said.
Great. Okay, I'm seeing another audience question here from Linda. It says, what do you think about requiring people to vote? And if they don't vote, what if there's a fine for not voting, or perhaps a credit on taxes for voting? Thoughts?
I think it would be very harmful to already underrepresented communities to impose fees on them for not participating in the system that we want them to participate in. So I feel like it's like maybe a backwards way of kind of approaching it. I think that folks should automatically be registered. Like that can be an aspect of like what is required or what is automatic, so that if you're already registered, all you have to do is just kind of go and do it. But I think that we should be trying to make folks understand and want to participate in the process. Like, we don't want folks just voting because I don't want to get a ticket. That's not exactly going to be like something that I'm knowledgeable about, that I'm trying to be educated about, that I'm trying to make a conscious decision about whoever I'm electing or whatever is getting passed. So it's really important that we're trying to make folks who want to be civically engaged and are doing it for that reason.
I agree. And a couple of proverbs come to mind. One is, hard wood grows slowly, or the hard way is the easy way, right? The idea that these kinds of, there's no quick fix, democracy is something that, and freedom is something that we have to struggle with and fight for every day. If we're not conscious in the way that we're approaching and protecting and nurturing our democratic functionality, then it's not going to work. And I think by taking somebody's autonomy away when it comes to voting defeats, it flies in it feels like it might be a way to increase voter participation, but in the long run, it's really going to be very damaging, I suspect.
So I would just add to that one of the funniest things I came across in doing the research for this paper was that in the 1910s and the 1920s, the legislature did consider a tax on people who didn't vote, and they called it a slacker tax, which I thought was like, so what a great name, the slacker tax, but it was never enacted, undoubtedly for the same reasons as we're discussing here.
Another question from Felicia. It says, can the panelists share an anecdote or story about a specific instance where maybe you've seen a positive change happen?
I've got one, two actually. One is in the most recent special election in Congressional District 22 in Tulare County, there was a voter who went to vote for the very first time. She had just become a citizen, and the polling location, they asked her to provide proof of her citizenship and bring her certificate with her, and she didn't have it. And so she walked out and walked straight, into my colleague who helped her vote. And I'm going to get teary-eyed just thinking about it, because I have not just that story, but there are many instances when we have been able to have that in-person, one-on-one contact with voters who otherwise would have walked away without voting, and they were able to vote. And it's really beautiful. Anybody can be a part of that positive change.
I think one anecdote for me is just maybe the redistricting process. We were able to have like a lot of listening sessions with communities and kind of talk to them around, how do you give public testimony? How do you call into the commission, and empowered folks to really use their voices and talk about their communities of interest and impact the final maps that were drawn, which I think was really big. The Black community was engaged in redistricting in a way that was historical and never really happened. And we're able to actually impact what the final maps look like and what their districts look like, which was really big to me.
I don't have an anecdote, but I think the history over the last 50, 70 years it's really pretty incredible that, especially in the last several years, as the rest of the country has gone on much of the rest of the country has gone in a different direction, California has continued looking for ways to increase access to the franchise. And, we're not there yet, right? We're not in voting nirvana yet, but we're so far from when we started, and it's a continuing story of improvements that make it easier for people to vote and more convenient and more accessible. So good for California, but we still have a ways to go.
Well, picking up on that theme, Elisa, there's a question here that says, what were some of the reasons why California changed so much after 1960 in terms of voter access and changing registration practices?
Yeah, so a lot of it was just nationally the civil rights movement and the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and a more activist Supreme Court that facilitated some of these changes. And a lot of it was just Democratic Party control of the state legislature. Because for many years before that, the Republicans were in control. And when Democrats became in control, they realized that their voters were maybe not voting as much as they could be or should be. So they wanted to make changes in the voting machinery to make it easier for their people to vote. I mean, the change in the purge I just mentioned it in passing, but in 1975, a law was passed to completely change the who bore the burden of allowing someone who didn't vote in the last election to continue being registered. So instead of the burden being on the voter, the burden was on the registrar of voters, and that completely changed things. Okay, so it was just a matter of putting their minds to it and seeing where their voters were and what they needed to do to get their voters out to the polls.
Well, we have time maybe for one more audience question, and there is an election coming up. There's a primary around the corner. So wondering what kind of work Kristen and Laurie are doing to prepare.
We're doing get out the vote outreach. So we'll be calling a lot of Black voters and definitely concentrating on hard to reach communities, maybe trying to do some in-reach with our coalition members, because there are a lot of folks that are currently incarcerated that still have the ability to vote and want to make sure that they're also empowered with those rights. And so definitely going to be doing a lot of outreach to community around voting this primary and helping them to understand, that that's important.
Yeah, we're in full get out the vote mode. We're about to transition from voter registration to what's your plan to vote. And all of our events on Mobilize America, you can look up Dolores Huerta Foundation on Mobilize America and find all of our virtual and in-person events, including a candidate forum happening tonight virtually, where all of the statewide races, you'll see the candidates speak about their positions on issues.
Excellent. Any final words before we wrap up today?
I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here. This is a really important topic, and I'm going to want to listen to anytime Elisa is speaking because I'm learning a lot, and I think at some point it's going to be a part of the history that she outlines what we've been able to accomplish in the census and the redistricting process, because it is historic. And I hope everybody chooses to participate in our democracy moving forward in all of our events.
Yeah, thank you. I will, that's a wonderful idea. I will look forward to continuing the saga as time goes on. And the way we ended the report when we wrote it in 2020 was, still lots of problems. We got to figure it out. And being on this panel has really given me some really great concrete ideas on how to move forward. So let's do it.
Yep, same. Thank you for having me. I think it's really beautiful and dope that a lot of people are on here and care about election, how to make the election turn out more diverse. So.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Elisa, Kristen, Laurie. It has been so educational and fascinating to listen to you. I just want to close by sharing some information about California on the Ballot events coming up this spring and summer. We have a beautiful new flyer that my colleague Stephen Loskotov just made for us, announcing season 2. So if you're interested in some upcoming programs, you can register on our website. We'll be talking with groups who have been historically excluded from democratic processes, like incarcerated, formerly and presently Californians, DACA recipients, and Indigenous groups in California. So please join us. We hope to see you at some of those programs. And as always, thanks so much to our wonderful panel for joining us. And thanks to my colleagues behind the scenes, Julie Fry, our president and CEO, Beth Segura, who's been manning the chat, and my program colleagues, Felicia Kelly, Lucena Lavalle, and John Lightfoot for all the guidance on this program. So thanks so much, everyone, and take care.